Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello everybody, it's Sunday the 10th of August 2025. A couple of days ago on Friday, we did a show with the host of the Disorder podcast on Trump's high summer of disorder, how short-term chaos is America's long-term global strategy, this mixing up of the short and long-term, and how Trump seems to be benefiting from it. Rather than calling it the high summer of disorder, we probably should have called it the hot summer. It's been a particularly hot summer, both literally and metaphorically. And one man who's given a great deal of thought to that hot summer and how we should be representing it, thinking about it, writing about it, is my guest today, Roy Scranton. He's a professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, and he's joining us from South Bend in Indiana. He has a new book out, an intriguing one. It's called Impasse: Climate Change and the Limits of Progress. Congratulations, Roy, on the new book. It's a hot summer, isn't it? Both literally and metaphorically these days.
It is, but there's a joke I often make that this is actually going to be the coolest, nicest summer of the rest of your life, because it's only going to get worse from here.
You're a professor of English, Roy, rather than a scientist, a technologist, a meteorologist. If that's such a word.
It's a big word.
Why are you so convinced? Is this a narrative that somehow comes naturally to you? What convinces you that we are at the indeed end of time?
That's a great question. And at first, I just want to say thanks for having me on. I appreciate being here and your attention to the book. So I'm an English professor. Why would anyone listen to me about climate change? I'm not asking you to listen to me about the science, right? The science is there. You can check my citations and my research. The thing is I didn't start working on climate change, and the science itself is not the topic I'm really thinking about and working on. The thing I'm thinking about and working on is how we respond to it, right? A kind of, I guess, a philosophical approach or existential approach. Like, what do we do with this information that we've been given, that we're on this trajectory, right, of increasing warming, increasing biodiversity collapse, and so on and so on? What do we do with this information? And I started working on this, I guess, a little more than 10 years ago. I was taking a seminar on the post-colonialism and the Anthropocene, because at that time I didn't really know what either word meant.
Yeah, and I want you to define that A word, because you've written about it extensively. An interesting piece back in 2013 on learning in the New York Times about learning how to die in the Anthropocene. So I'm curious what that word actually means. Right.
Well, and this is sort of interesting. I was working at the time on my English PhD on a book on World War II and American literature, and I thought this seminar on Anthropocene and post-colonialism or whatever might help me think in a kind of different way about the crisis people felt in World War II. But what I learned that summer, reading up on the most recent IPCC reports, World Bank had put out a big report the year prior on 4 degrees, what happens when we get there and why we need to avoid it. Other climate science, like from the scientist David Archer, just like really doing a deep dive on the And the science side of it, what I realized was that there wasn't any good plan to deal with it. Like it wasn't a problem that anybody was solving. It was just happening, and all the science was pointing toward increasing existential threat, increasing potential catastrophe, and a kind of concatenation of effects that could really even threaten civilization as we know it. And so that's what got me interested in climate change at the beginning, was reading up on all this information. And that piece you mentioned was sort of my first foray into the topic. But I've been writing on it since then, and continuing to learn more and think about it more. The Anthropocene, just to go back to that for a second, was a notion floated by first some Earth system scientists, and then it got taken up by different people. It was the idea that of a new geological period in Earth's history. The idea that we're in a new period that could be identified by the human effect on the geology of the planet. Now, the International Commission on Stratigraphy and the scientists who decide, what the eras are, the Holocene or the Pleistocene or what have you, they eventually decided not to use the term, not to adopt the term formally. But people still use it informally, and it serves as a kind of conceptual shorthand to gesture toward this really remarkable characteristic of our modern period, in which human beings, human societies are profoundly affecting the climate and geology of the planet in a way that will have repercussions for thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years.
You wrote an interesting piece, actually, earlier this month. It came out in BAFLA. It's entitled Apocalypse, not Apocalypse Now, Apocalypse 24/7. What does it mean to say the world is ending? Is that a particularly difficult story to tell, Roy, in our age when everything seems to be short-termism? We're obsessed with social media, where every day there's some new scandal or outrage, and then the next day we forget about it. Whereas we have this apocalypse 24/7 hanging over us, and it often doesn't seem to get covered.
Yeah, that's you bring out two important aspects. There's kind of this disjunction, if you will, like a temporal disjunction we live in, right? So on the one hand, the climate's getting warmer. There's all kinds of ways in which things seem to be heading in a very dire direction. But it's not happening in the way that we tend to traditionally narrativize apocalypse, right? Science fiction novels, movies, what have you. The typical narrative of apocalypse is that there's an event, it wipes things out or resets or destroys civilization, and then you start over, and you've got your band of hardy survivors fighting off the zombies or whatever. And that's the sort of way we tend to think about apocalypse. Like it's something that's going to happen, or it already happened. It's a discrete event that it happens, and then we're in a new place. But that's not really the situation we're in with climate change and the various other kinds of challenges and crises that we face. What we're seeing with those is it's this gradual increase, these changes that have effects that are sometimes hard to follow through and sometimes hard to see. Just this constant, consistent ratcheting and working against us, right? In terms of noticing it and making sense of it, is the fact that we very quickly get adapted, right? It takes us.
It's the story.
Yeah.
And of course, the metaphor, which we often tell, is of the frog in the boiling water. It doesn't quite realize that the water's boiling because because it slowly warms up, and by the time the frog realizes it's boiling, the frog is cooked. Are we that frog then, Roy?
We are, and it's ironic because it's one of the things humans are best at, right? Is adapting ourselves to new and different environments. That's one of the things that have made humans so successful as a species on the planet, right? But it's also working against us in this case because it only takes us 2 or 3 years to start to feel like, oh yeah, it's normal for it to be, 90 degrees in Indiana in June, right? where I live, or something like that. Like the new normal. We adapt very quickly. The other thing you bring up is the kind of the 24/7 media cycle, and the constant cycle of distraction and refocus. The way that our attention is consistently drawn toward whatever the scandal or crisis of the moment is, makes it very hard for us to piece together like a longer sense of the importance of anything that's happening. It becomes this kind of churn that we get locked into. It's really challenging. It's really challenging for making sense of the times we live in.
What about the politics of all this? I know you've given a great deal of thought to it. You mentioned that we're not quite able to come to terms with how things are changing, that we're all frogs in a metaphorical pot of boiling water. But some of us are more able than others. We know that Silicon Valley billionaires are already either planning their retreats to estates in New Zealand or perhaps to other planets. Is there a politics to the impasse you describe?
Yes. One of the notable things about climate change, and another one of the things that make it so difficult to talk about or to do anything about, is that it's deeply, deeply political, and it's deeply polarized in that way. But in more complicated ways, actually, than we tend to think, right? So climate change tends to be a left, liberal, progressive, blue issue. And then you tend to have on the right, conservative, Republican side, you tend to have kind of climate change denial or a minimization or various ways of saying that it's not that big a deal or it's not that important. And that's part of what shapes the conversation. Some of the complexities that come out of that is that we have seen in recent years the emergence of small pockets of self-identified eco-fascists. There were some horrific attacks in recent years. Active shooters in places, and who distributed manifestos identifying.
What exactly is eco-fascism? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way these people identified it, they identified themselves, and the way that the eco-fascist community, such as it is, talks about it, is that it's essentially a kind of it's pairing a kind of strong, aggressive, even violent nationalism with a concern for environmental issues. And so it tends to be very anti-immigration. It can be racially coded. And it has, these kinds of ideas floating around today have roots in, Nazi ideology and some of these other things. But there's always been a complicated relationship between environmental activism, conservation, and nationalism, and concerns about immigration.
Yeah, I mean, we remember history lesson that that there was a significant group within originally the National Socialists in Germany who were very much concerned with the land. Many of them were purged in the Night of the Long Knives in 1932. The subtitle of your book, Roy, is Climate Change and the Limits of Progress. I know in the book you write a lot about rethinking progress. Is that the core message in the book? Is that we need to accept that progress itself is a myth? That's
one of the key messages. One of the key things I'm working out there. I mean, progress has always been, it's an idea, right? It's not,
Well, it's
I
very
mean,
much of an American idea.
it's very important to the sense of American identity and the sense of America as a country from its founding onward, right? There's the famous painting of progress, right, across the plains,
Westward progress, yes.
westward progress, chasing the, driving out the Native Americans. Yeah, and so it's a very American idea, but it has its roots in, as I'm sure you know, right, like 18th century European Enlightenment culture, and even before. And it's the problem with progress, right, is that the fundamental idea at the root of progress is that the more we learn to control nature, the better our lives will be. But the problem is that nature is bigger than us, right? It as we've seen, as we've come to learn, sort of shockingly, with climate change and numerous other environmental crises, we're not smart enough to plan for all the effects of the things that we do in the natural world.
In other words, we may not be interested in nature, but nature is very much interested in us.
That's right. That's right. And so the idea that and progress has its answer for this problem, which is of course more progress, right? We need more science, we need more technology, we need carbon scrubbers. We can just figure it out. But there's no, that's a faith commitment, right?
But it's more than a faith commitment, isn't it, Roy? We've done a number of shows with technologists, business school experts, entrepreneurs who argue that there are technologies to address this.
There are potential technologies that could possibly address climate change if they were to be scaled up, if they could be developed in time, et cetera, in a lot of ways. And there's not a lot of good reason to believe that this is plausible, or that, for instance, green energy transition could actually happen. As we've seen with the increase in renewable energy with solar and wind power, right? What happens isn't that replaces fossil fuel power. What happens is that we use more energy, right? Because it makes it a little cheaper. And that's Givon's paradox, but it's just like a consistent feature of energy transitions in history. There's a great book on this. What energy transitions are not, they're not transitions where one kind of energy replaces another. What we see is that one kind of energy gets added to another, right? Wood, we didn't stop using wood because we started using coal. We used wood and coal. Similarly with oil, right? We didn't stop using coal. We used coal and oil. To now, I mean, last year's we used the most coal in the history of using coal, right? The highest coal consumption in history was last year. So there's little reason to believe that either there are technological solutions or our policy solutions are really going to be able to respond to climate change and the climate crisis in time to bend the curve or stop catastrophic warming.
So you will find, as I'm sure you know, you will find many people who strongly disagree with you on that. What some people might also say, well, if Roy had been around in the middle of the 19th century, he would have been arguing about industrialization and ruining the countryside and all the implications of machines and motors and engines.
Yeah.
And while some of that's obviously come true, we're still here today.
Let me say two things about that. The first is that more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions in history have happened since 1989, right? That was the year that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was founded by the United Nations to address the problem of global warming and climate change. It was also the year that James Hansen, the great atmospheric scientist, went before Congress and testified about the danger that climate change posed, right? And so since then, we've doubled our greenhouse gas emissions globally. So that tells you, and that was 35, 36 years ago, that tells you what our kind of success record is in dealing with this global problem. The other thing I'll say is that what I thought you were going to say is that, well, progress, obviously you just look around, right? Lower infant mortality, increased aggregate wealth, all kinds of ways, like increased longevity. Like you can point to all kinds of ways in which today, right, life is just levels, just better, right? Quality, length, etc., than it would have been for your average person in the 19th century or the 15th century or 3000 BCE. And that's true. That's all true. But to presume that is a result of some kind of moral or cultural progress, I think, is a mistake. But what we can point to quite clearly as a cause for these effects is an increase in energy consumption from the 18th century onward. A massive, significant increase in energy consumption, first from coal through the 19th century, then from oil and gas, just skyrocketing, like a 3,000% increase in energy consumption. And that, of course, the effects are huge. Can that go on? Can we just keep consuming more and more energy to keep progressing? I doubt it very much. And there's, I think, also not good material.
Right. And I think your case is an interesting one. It's certainly strengthened by the current AI revolution. We've done a number of shows which suggest that AI and the AI revolution is rooted in more and more energy consumption, nuclear power. We're going to do a show on that next week. You're not, as you acknowledge, you're not a scientist. You're a professor of English. You're interested in how to tell narratives. We've done shows before, actually, with people who have written books about how to tell this particular story of climate change. You've written extensively on it. You've suggested that what you call narrative in the Anthropocene is the enemy. Mm-hmm. You've also written about how our hubris will be our end, another interesting piece you wrote in the New York Times. Is this ultimately, in your mind at least, Roy, is this a question of how we tell our story? Is this a narrative issue?
I think, narrative is how I approach the question. And I think it's, so let me say that I'm not, my book, this book, these other things I've written, I don't think that somebody's going to read my book, or everybody's going to read my book, or whatever, and then we'll fix it, right? We'll find the right narrative and we can fix it. Maybe I used to think that if enough people in positions of power had a strong enough sense of the threat climate change posed, if enough people voted the right way or whatever, that we would be able to deal with it in some way. I don't really think that's the case anymore. So my book, particularly Impasse, the position it takes, that develops, is one of ethical pessimism. Essentially, how do we live with a situation where change is happening out of our control? The future is both paradoxically extremely looks to be catastrophic, right? Extremely, extremely dangerous. And also kind of radically unknowable, right? And not just unknowable in the way that history used to be unknowable. It's always been unknowable. One could never predict inventions and so on and so on. But the fact of the matter is, never before in the history of the planet has so much carbon been moved from the Earth into the atmosphere so quickly. They have a good sense from paleoclimate records what a climate transition looks like on a normal Earth scale, but we've never before in history has a global civilization of humans existed in one of these transitions, right? Humans have lived through climate changes before as small hunter-gatherer groups, easy to move around, not dependent on infrastructure set in place, not living in cities. And so we're running this experiment on the planet. The perturbations, the effects, the shocks to the system are going to be significant, and there's no way to know. There's no way for any of us to know how that's all going to play out. It's probably going to be pretty messy, but there's this real, I don't know, like a gap, a disjunction. There's a kind of wall. When if we're looking into the future, there's no way for us to know how, like, we're going to get through what's coming, right? Or what human life will look like on the other side. And so in terms of a narrative problem, right, we're narrative animals, right? This is how we organize our sense being in the world. We tell stories. We live in these imaginary constructs called nations, and so on and so on. So we can't function without some kind of narratives to make sense of our lives together. But we're facing this problem now where none of our narratives can actually cope with the reality that we have to face. That is, I think, maybe the root problem that I think we're all coping with.
And we have alternative narratives. As I said, some people would offer the scientific narrative, say we can get out of this, but you offer a different kind of narrative. Maybe, shall we say, a humanities narrative. You've written about what the humanities can teach us about climate change. You've asked why we cling to art in apocalyptic times, and your book brings in a lot of literature and art and films. So what's the alternative narrative if we use the humanities, if we use art, if we use literature, if we use film?
Right. Well, one of the humanities is a shorthand for the mass of human culture through history, right? The humanities includes books that were written thousands of years ago, and poems that were written yesterday. And you can even, history and philosophy of science is part of the humanities, right? How we understand the history of scientific endeavor as a mode of being in the world. But the thing that art can do and the humanities can do in a particular way, I think, is help us face this kind of this paradoxical or contradictory or this unknowable future. They can help us confront that, because one of the great things that art can do is allow us to hold multiple views, multiple interpretations, multiple perspectives together in a kind of productive tension, right? You can watch a movie or read a book or watch Hamlet, and you can have one interpretation, and you can have another interpretation of why Hamlet does this particular thing, or what it means, or the significance. And part of the power of maybe the most effective affecting works of art over time is that they can sustain more of this intention. That's not going to save us. It's not going to, it's not going to protect us from a wildfire, but it, I think, allows us, it gives us a way to help think about our situation, right? Facing a future that we can't possibly know, compelled to narrate our lives to ourselves, and yet knowing that all those narratives are going to somehow be ultimately inadequate.
It reminds me of the scene in the Decameron during a terrible plague where people were partying, or Italians at least, late medieval Italians were partying on their way to their graves. Is that what you're suggesting? Should this be a moment of carnival, of fun, telling stories, singing songs?
I think that would be better than going to war over it. Yeah. I mean, I think the problem is that there's not going to be one plague and then we're all dead. There is going to be a plague and then another plague and then another plague, and we're going to keep living right in between, and we're going to have to pick up the people who survived the plague, and we're going to have to keep figure out what to rebuild or what to leave unbuilt. And so there's a deeper and sort of longer term concern here, which is, for me, it's the ethics, right? The ethics of care. How do we live? This is a question that I ask in the book, and that informs my teaching, that I come back to again and again. Like, how do we live ethically in a world of catastrophe, right? If we can't depend on progress to give us justice at some point in the future when everything's better, how do we live ethically now? How do we deal with some of these crises and some of these challenges now, in a way that does service to our common humanity, right? Hedonism is I think a perfectly justified option in response to the kind of catastrophe we face, but I don't think it's a fully ethical response.
You bring an interesting narrative of your own. You're an unusual fellow, Roy. You're not just a professor at Notre Dame, but you have a background. You were in the military, and you use a lot of military metaphors. You had another New York Times opinion piece from 2019 about why climate change is not world war. Mm-hmm. In terms of learning how to live, and I'm quoting you here, ethically in apocalyptic times, do you think you bring, because you served in the American military and you've seen things which most of us haven't, do you think you bring a certain wisdom, so to speak, about how to live ethically?
Well, I certainly hope I learned something from my time in the military and from my time as a soldier in Iraq. It would be unfortunate if I wasted that time. I can't claim that being a soldier or being a veteran of a war zone necessarily provides any kind of special wisdom or insight. And in fact, one of my other books, I've written a fair bit about war and war culture, a novel, War Porn, and then also a scholarly book about World War II in American literature. And one of the arguments in that book is actually that we've come to understand the experience of war as this kind of ecstatic trauma, right? In a way that I think does a disservice to the complicated truth of war. So, I do think I learned things, and I certainly talk about it in that essay you talked about earlier, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. What I saw in Baghdad in 2003 shook my sense of reality, of how stable I thought reality was, and it also helped me see what could happen and how easily things could turn badly violent when you take away some of the core infrastructure that we depend on every day. So there was a lot. We'd probably need another couple hours to get into everything from that time. But there was certainly I learned a great deal there.
Do you have one anecdote from the time in Baghdad that somehow captures what you learned and how this informs your arguments in Impasse about the limits of progress and how we can live ethically in our own environmentally apocalyptic time?
I don't know that I have one one particular anecdote. I mean, the story I tell from in Learning to Die is that that seems useful. Was that we were running missions. This was in the summer of 2003, so it was just after the invasion. Things were fairly chaotic, and I was in an artillery unit, and the mission we were doing was to drive around Baghdad and pick up unexploded ordnance, which was an exciting tasking in a variety of ways. And one of the ways that it was exciting was that IEDs were beginning to appear, right? These improvised explosives devices that insurgents or even just disgruntled Iraqis or what have you would sort of put in under trash on the roadside, or sometimes they would dig out little potholes and hide them there. And it started to, so you'd be driving along and the road would just blow up right underneath you. And it
literally was apocalypse 24/7.
It was a very dramatic time. And I was the battery commander's driver. So I was our captain's driver. And so I was driving, we were in the lead vehicle, because that's in the Army, you lead from the front. So I was driving the lead vehicle in our convoy. And so like I not only had to watch out for IEDs for me, but if I missed something, then it could mean that any member of our convoy, any of the trucks in our convoy carrying, I'll remind you, all this unexploded ordnance could get blown up. And it really started to affect me. I was starting to have to freak out a little bit and to have a hard time, because it seemed like I was scared, and it was a lot of stress.
And you were, of course, highly responsible for everybody else, because if you missed something, somebody else would die. That's
precisely it. And the way that I dealt with it was to consider myself as already dead. I read this, there's this book, the Hagakure, The Way of the Samurai, that I learned about from a Jim Jarmusch film, and it's like a Buddhist samurai guide. And one of the sections in that book, the author advises samurai to act as if you're already dead, and actually not to just act as if you're already dead, but to meditate upon your death daily, to think about all the different ways that you could get killed, in order to free yourself for action in the moment. And I started doing that, and it was extremely helpful, because then I could just attend to my responsibilities. I was no longer connected to my own mortality in the same way that I had been before, because now it didn't matter. Like whether I died didn't matter. I could just do my job and try not to let anybody else get killed. And that sort of became an important exercise for me. And it connected to other forms of meditation. It connected to how I started thinking about climate change. What, if we face this profound change because of climate change in our civilization, like what would it mean to say that our civilization is already dead, right? Like if we could accept that everything has to change in some substantial way, then what kind of change could we make?
So finally, Roy, a lot of people are going to be watching this and it's not very uplifting. It's depressing, but maybe we're just telling the truth. This question of how we live ethically in environmentally apocalyptic times.
Yeah.
This isn't about, most environmental shows or most books about the environment. Maybe you do some recycling, or you get an electric vehicle, or you get solar panels, or you stop getting on aircrafts. But for you, maybe we should all be, if we want to live ethically in environmentally apocalyptic times, anyone watching this, should we all be thinking that the last member of our species, that the lights are about to go out? Is that I know it's not the most practical of books, but is that your practical advice? What do you want to leave people with after they've read Impasse about how to learn to live ethically in environmentally
Yeah.
apocalyptic time. Should they be like you in Baghdad and simply accept, or like a samurai, that they're dead?
In some sense, yeah, that's yes, that's the position I'm arguing with, again, if with ethical pessimism, not necessarily to accept our own death, although I think that's really, it's a useful spiritual exercise, but to let go of our commitments to a just world in the future, or our sense of what a good life means in modern society, or this idea that somehow if we had the right policy or we voted for the right person, like things would work out and get better. We need to let go of all that. We need to actually do a hard reckoning and think about what we can actually do with our lives, what we can accomplish, where we can put our energy, and have a little more humility about what we can work on, right? I think if I was giving advice, I would say give up on saving the world, because you can't. The world will take care of itself, for good or for ill. Instead, look around you, look around your community, and see what work you can do there. See what needs to be done around you, with the people that you pass every day, or the people you talk to, the people around you. See what you can accomplish there, because that's the life you live. Like that's the real world you're living in, not this like fantasy projection, right, of some global civilization, which, I mean, yeah, it does exist, but it's not where we live our day to day.
Yeah, it's not a message, this sort of deeply pessimistic quietism that will, I think, everyone will either appreciate or agree with, but maybe it's a very honest one. Congratulations, Roy, on the new book. It's out. The world hasn't ended yet. It may one day, but so far we're still around. Your new book, Impasse: Climate Change and the Limits of Progress, is an important contribution to the debate. And I hope you'll be around in the next couple of years, Roy. We'll get you back on the show to check in whether you and I are the last species left on Earth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me on.